White man slaps billionaire's black son. The consequences of prejudice on Flight 2187. Slap. The sound echoed through the first-class cabin. A child's shocked cry followed as heads turned to witness the aftermath. A white businessman stood over a young black boy, his hand still suspended in the air, rage turning to sudden uncertainty as he registered the stunned silence around him. What he didn't see was the tall figure who had just reboarded the plane, the boy's billionaire father, witnessing everything from the cabin entrance. In an instant, lives were forever altered. A hasty judgment, a painful humiliation, a father's controlled fury. Today we explore the explosive chain of events that followed when one man's bias led him to slap a child on a first-class flight, not knowing the boy's powerful father was watching it all unfold. What happened next would reshape not just their lives, but spark a national conversation about prejudice, privilege, and consequences. Before we dive into this incredible true story, if you've ever experienced or witnessed discrimination, or simply believe in treating everyone with dignity, regardless of appearance, hit that subscribe button and like this video. Your support helps us bring more stories that matter to light. Now let's begin. James Richardson had always considered himself a reasonable man. At 43, he had climbed the corporate ladder at Westfield Financial through what he believed was pure merit, long hours, strategic networking, and an unwavering confidence that made others listen when he spoke. As the senior vice president of operations, James was accustomed to first-class travel, five-star hotels, and the respect that came with his position. On this particular Monday morning in September, James was boarding Delta Flight 2187 from New York to San Francisco. The quarterly board meeting had been moved up by 2 days, forcing him to rearrange his schedule and cutting short his weekend getaway in the Hamptons. He was irritable, operating on 4 hours of sleep and 2 strong coffees. James settled into seat 3A, immediately taking out his laptop to review the presentation he would deliver tomorrow. The first-class cabin was his mobile office, a space where he expected calm, efficiency, and respect. He needed these 6 hours to refine his strategy. Flight attendants greeted passengers with practiced smiles as the first-class cabin filled. James barely looked up, focused on his spreadsheets, and mentally calculating how the new acquisition might affect third-quarter projections. 3 rows behind him, 11-year-old Marcus Johnson walked onto the plane with his nanny, Elise. Marcus wore designer jeans, spotless white sneakers, and a casual button-up shirt, clothes that were clearly expensive but that any boy his age might wear. His father, Robert Johnson, founder and CEO of Horizon Technologies, had stepped off the plane briefly to take an urgent call about a merger in Singapore. Robert had promised to be back before takeoff. Marcus was excited. This was his first time accompanying his father on a business trip since his mother had passed away 6 months earlier. Robert had promised to take him to Silicon Valley, to show him where the future is built. Despite his immense wealth, Robert Johnson was known for his humility, often traveling with minimal security and maintaining a low profile unless attending official functions. As Marcus settled into his seat, he took out his tablet. Like many children his age, he was a bundle of energy, his legs swinging back and forth beneath the seat, occasionally bumping the back of James's chair. Marcus was unaware of this minor disturbance as he excitedly scrolled through games. The first bump to his seat barely registered in James's consciousness. By the third, his jaw had tightened. By the fifth, he had turned around, casting an irritated glance to identify the source of his disruption. What James saw was a young black boy in first class, apparently alone except for a woman he presumed was a flight attendant speaking to him. In James's tired, stressed mind, assumptions formed rapidly. A child who didn't belong in first class. A child who hadn't been taught proper behavior. A child who was disrupting his important work. The next kick to his seat coincided with James hitting a critical error in his spreadsheet, and something snapped. James unbuckled his seatbelt, stood up, and turned around fully. "Can you control that child?" he hissed at Elise, who was helping another passenger store a bag. "This is first class, not a playground." Before Elise could respond, James leaned closer to Marcus, his voice low but sharp. "Listen, kid, stop kicking my seat. Some of us are here to work, not play games." Marcus looked up, surprised and confused. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't realize." But James cut him off with a dismissive wave. "Just behave yourself. This isn't a place for—" He paused, looking Marcus up and down. "Children who don't know how to act properly." Something in his tone made it clear he wasn't just referring to Marcus's age. Marcus, raised to be respectful to adults, nodded and pulled his legs in tight, his earlier excitement dimming. He returned to his tablet, but his posture had changed. Shoulders hunched, trying to make himself smaller, less noticeable. 10 minutes later, as final boarding continued, Marcus received a text message from his father saying he'd be back on board in 2 minutes. Excited, Marcus stood up to look toward the entrance of the plane for his dad. In his enthusiasm, he accidentally bumped James's seat again. This time, James didn't just turn around. He stood up, stepped into the aisle, and confronted Marcus directly. "I told you to stop," he snapped, loud enough that several passengers turned to look. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, his voice small. "I was just looking for my—" The slap happened so quickly that several passengers would later debate exactly what they saw. James, acting on impulse and frustration, swung his hand and struck Marcus across the shoulder and upper arm, hard enough to knock the tablet from the boy's hands. "That's what happens when you don't listen," James said, his voice cold. The cabin went silent. Marcus's eyes welled with tears, not from physical pain as much as from shock and humiliation. Elise, who had been helping another passenger, rushed forward. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, putting herself between Marcus and James. "Teaching some manners," James replied, straightening his tie. "Someone clearly needs to." It was at this moment that a deep voice came from behind James. That someone would be me. James turned to find himself face to face with Robert Johnson. At 6'2", Robert's presence was commanding even in casual clothes. There was no flash, no obvious display of wealth, just a simple, well-cut blazer over a t-shirt and jeans. Yet something in his calm, measured stance made James take an involuntary step back. "I believe you just put your hands on my son," Robert said. His voice controlled, but with an edge that made several nearby passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. James blinked, confusion crossing his face. "Your son?" he repeated, looking between Robert and Marcus. "Yes," Robert replied. "Marcus Johnson, my son, whom you just struck on a public aircraft, which, I should mention, is a federal offense." The realization of who was standing before him hit James like a physical blow. Robert Johnson, founder of Horizon Technologies, the man whose net worth exceeded $8.6 billion, whose company was revolutionizing clean energy storage and who had recently been featured on the cover of Forbes. A man whose investment firm owned a significant stake in Westfield Financial, James's employer. "Mr. Johnson," James stammered, his face draining of color. "There's been a misunderstanding." "I saw everything from the jetway," Robert cut him off. "What exactly did I misunderstand? The part where you struck a child, or the part where you implied he didn't belong here because of how he looks?" By now, the flight attendants had gathered. The chief purser approached cautiously. "Is there a problem, Mr. Johnson?" she asked, clearly recognizing him. "This man," Robert said, pointing at James but not breaking eye contact, "just assaulted my son. I want him removed from the flight, and I will be pressing charges." James's confidence evaporated. "Look, I apologize if I overreacted, but the boy was kicking my seat, disrupting my work. I have an important presentation." "So important that it justifies putting your hands on someone else's child?" Robert asked. "Would you have done the same if Marcus were white?" The question hung in the air. James opened his mouth, then closed it. "That's what I thought," Robert said quietly. The chief purser turned to James. "Sir, I need you to gather your belongings. The captain would like to speak with you before deplaning." "Deplaning? You can't be serious," James protested, looking around for support but finding none. "I have a meeting tomorrow that I cannot miss." "You should have thought about that before assaulting a minor," the purser replied firmly. As James reluctantly collected his laptop and briefcase, Robert knelt beside Marcus, who was still fighting back tears. "Are you okay, son?" he asked gently. Marcus nodded, though his lips trembled. "I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't mean to cause trouble." Robert pulled him into a hug. "You didn't cause anything. None of this is your fault." As James was escorted toward the front of the plane, Robert stood. "Wait," he called. The group paused, and Robert approached, his expression solemn. "I want you to know something," he said to James, his voice low enough that only those nearby could hear. "I could destroy your career with one phone call. But that's not who I am, and it's not the example I want to set for my son." James swallowed hard, unable to meet Robert's gaze. "Instead," Robert continued, "I'm going to make sure that what happened here today leads to something positive, something that might help the next black child who encounters someone like you." With that, Robert returned to his son, leaving James to face the consequences of his actions. The following 48 hours were the most humiliating of James Richardson's life. After being escorted off the flight, he was questioned by airport police. Though he tried to minimize the incident, multiple witnesses confirmed that he had struck Marcus. Because the incident occurred on an aircraft, it fell under federal jurisdiction. James was charged with simple assault, a misdemeanor that could result in up to 6 months in jail. Released on his own recognizance, James checked into an airport hotel and frantically called his boss, explaining why he wouldn't make the meeting. By then, however, news had already reached Westfield Financial. A passenger had recorded the latter part of the incident, and the video was spreading across social media. First-class racism was trending, with James's face blurred but his company clearly mentioned. By Tuesday morning, Westfield Financial released a statement. "We are aware of an incident involving one of our executives. The alleged behavior does not reflect our company's values of respect and inclusivity. The employee has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation." James's administrative leave became permanent 2 days later. The board, concerned about the company's image and, more importantly, their relationship with Robert Johnson's investment firm, terminated James's employment, but the professional consequences paled in comparison to the personal ones. James's wife was horrified by his actions. His children's friends' parents suddenly had scheduling conflicts for play dates. His country club membership came under review. For the first time in his life, James Richardson experienced what it felt like to be judged negatively based on a single incident, to have assumptions made about his character, to be excluded from spaces he had always taken for granted. Meanwhile, Robert Johnson had indeed filed charges, but his response went far beyond the legal system. In a thoughtful LinkedIn post that went viral, he reflected on the incident without naming James. "Yesterday, my son experienced something I've spent my life preparing him for, yet hoped he would never face. He was judged not by his behavior, but by preconceptions about who belongs where. As a father, I am heartbroken. As a black man who has worked hard to create opportunities, I am reminded that success doesn't shield our children from bias. I choose to use this moment not for vengeance but for change." Today, Horizon Technologies is launching the Belonging Initiative, committing $50 million to programs that address implicit bias in corporate America and create pathways for underrepresented youth in business and technology. The announcement generated widespread media coverage, with many business leaders publicly supporting the initiative. Robert declined all interview requests, focusing instead on Marcus and ensuring his son understood that the adult's behavior reflected the adult's limitations, not Marcus's worth. 3 months after the incident, James Richardson sat in a community center in Brooklyn, part of a restorative justice program that was a condition of his plea agreement. The charges had been reduced to disorderly conduct, with no jail time but mandatory community service and participation in bias awareness training. Initially resentful, James had approached the program as something to endure. But something unexpected had happened over the weeks. Listening to stories of how unconscious bias affected people's daily lives, James began to recognize patterns in his own thinking. The assumptions he had made about Marcus, that he didn't belong, that he wasn't being properly supervised, that he needed to be taught a lesson, reflected biases he had never acknowledged. For the first time, James considered how differently he might have reacted to a white child in the same situation. Would he have assumed the child was misbehaving rather than just being energetic? Would he have spoken to the child with such condescension? Would he have ever considered putting his hands on the child? The honest answers disturbed him. Meanwhile, Robert Johnson's Belonging Initiative was gaining momentum. The program had already funded implicit bias training for employees at over 100 companies, launched scholarships for underrepresented students interested in business and technology, and created a mentorship network connecting these students with industry leaders. Robert had also worked with several airlines to develop training for flight staff on recognizing and addressing bias-related incidents among passengers. Delta, the airline on which the incident occurred, was the first to implement the program, with others quickly following suit. Marcus, with his father's guidance, had processed the incident through therapy and open conversations. Though the experience had been painful, it had also given him insight beyond his years. He began speaking to his classmates about his experience, starting a student group focused on inclusion and respect. 6 months after the incident, something unexpected happened. James Richardson sent a letter to Robert Johnson requesting a meeting. After careful consideration, Robert agreed. The meeting took place in a private conference room at Robert's New York office. James arrived early, nervous but determined. When Robert entered, he extended his hand. The handshake was brief but civil. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," James began. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to talk to." "I'm curious about what prompted this request," Robert replied, his tone neutral. James took a deep breath. "I wanted to apologize to you and especially to your son in person. Not for legal reasons or to salvage my reputation, but because I've come to understand the impact of my actions in a way I didn't before." Robert studied him carefully. "Go on." "The bias awareness program showed me that what happened that day wasn't just about being tired or stressed. It was about assumptions I made because your son is black. Assumptions I wouldn't have made about a white child. I've had to face that truth, and it's been humbling." Robert nodded slowly. "And what do you plan to do with this realization?" "I've been volunteering with youth programs in underserved communities, sharing my experience as a cautionary tale. I don't expect forgiveness, but I am committed to ensuring I never make someone feel the way I made your son feel." After a thoughtful pause, Robert spoke. "I appreciate your honesty, Mr. Richardson. As for meeting Marcus, I'm not ready to grant that request. He's still processing what happened, and my priority is his well-being." "I understand completely," James replied. "But," Robert continued, "I do believe in second chances when they're earned through genuine change. The Belonging Initiative is launching a speaker series featuring perspectives from both those who've experienced bias and those who've recognized and addressed their own biases. If you're serious about transformation, that might be a place to contribute. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was an opportunity to turn a moment of shame into something meaningful." 1 year after the incident, the landscape had changed in subtle but significant ways. The Belonging Initiative had expanded to include corporate training programs, community outreach, and policy advocacy. Its impact was beginning to show in tangible ways: more inclusive hiring practices, reduced reports of bias incidents, and increased retention of underrepresented employees at participating companies. James Richardson had rebuilt his life, though not as he might have once envisioned it. After struggling to find comparable employment in finance, he had started a consulting practice focused on helping companies create inclusive workplace cultures. His personal experience, combined with the knowledge gained through his mandated training and volunteer work, gave him a unique perspective that proved valuable. He had spoken twice at Belonging Initiative events, sharing his journey with unflinching honesty. While some criticized his inclusion in the program, many acknowledged the power of hearing from someone who had confronted their own biases. Robert Johnson had continued to build both his business empire and his advocacy work. He and Marcus had grown even closer through the experience, their conversations about race, privilege, and resilience strengthening their bond. Marcus was thriving academically and socially, his confidence restored through his father's unwavering support and the positive change that had emerged from his painful experience. On the anniversary of the incident, Robert published another LinkedIn post that quickly went viral. "A year ago today, my son experienced discrimination that changed both our lives. In the moment, I had a choice: to respond with anger or with purpose. I chose purpose, not because it was easy, but because sustainable change requires more than righteous indignation." What I've learned is that addressing bias isn't about public shaming or cancellation. It's about creating systems and cultures where everyone's humanity is recognized. It's about holding people accountable while allowing for growth and redemption. The man who struck my son has become an unlikely ally in this work. His willingness to acknowledge his biases and work to address them represents the kind of transformation our society needs. Not everyone gets a platform after causing harm, but when genuine change occurs, acknowledging it strengthens our collective progress. To those who experience bias, your dignity is not determined by others' perceptions. To those who recognize bias in themselves, your value isn't diminished by acknowledging your growth areas. The work continues, one conversation, one policy, one mind at a time. The post generated thoughtful discussions across social media platforms and in corporate boardrooms. It wasn't a neat, Hollywood ending where everyone became best friends. It was messier, more complex, and ultimately more meaningful. A recognition that real change happens not through single dramatic moments, but through ongoing commitment to doing better. As for Marcus, now 12, he had learned something profound, that his worth was inherent, not conferred by others' recognition. On his next flight with his father, he sat tall in his first-class seat, confident in the knowledge that he belonged, not because of his father's wealth or status, but because of his fundamental dignity as a human being. That knowledge was something no one could ever take away with a slap, a word, or a dismissive glance. It was the most valuable legacy his father could have given him. This story of one moment on an airplane reveals a fundamental truth about bias. It doesn't require malice to cause harm. James Richardson didn't board that flight intending to discriminate. He didn't see himself as someone who would judge a child based on race. Yet, in a moment of stress, his unconscious biases surfaced in a way that had profound consequences. The incident between James, Marcus, and Robert reminds us that addressing bias isn't about villainizing individuals, but about recognizing patterns that exist within our culture and within ourselves. It's about having the courage to look inward, to question our assumptions, and to change our behavior. For Robert and Marcus Johnson, the incident became not just a painful memory, but a catalyst for meaningful change. For James Richardson, it became a mirror that reflected aspects of himself he had never acknowledged. And for the broader community, it became an opportunity to engage in difficult but necessary conversations about who belongs in which spaces and why we make the assumptions we do. So I ask you, what assumptions do you make about people based on their appearance? What spaces do you unconsciously believe certain people don't belong in? What would it take for you to recognize and address those biases? If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been judged unfairly, or if you've recognized biases in your own thinking, please hit that subscribe button and share this video. Your engagement helps us bring more stories that challenge perspectives and inspire change. Remember, transformation begins not with grand gestures, but with simple awareness. The willingness to see others and ourselves more clearly. It's a journey we're all on together. One interaction, one reflection, one choice at a time. Thank you for listening. Until next time, this is Racism Diary, asking you to consider, what will you do with your next opportunity to choose between reaction and response, between assumption and understanding, between the easy path and the right one? If this story made you think about your own experiences with prejudice or bias, whether you faced it or recognized it in yourself, hit that subscribe button now. Help us reach those who need to hear these stories. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Have you ever been in a situation where you were judged unfairly? How did you handle it? Or have you ever caught yourself making assumptions about someone based on their appearance? What did you learn? Remember, every like, comment, and share helps these important conversations reach more people. Subscribe now and join our community committed to learning, growing, and creating a world where everyone's dignity is respected.